Boker Tov, everyone. This week's Parasha Evrei is beautiful, and there's so many important items that come up within it. But the thing that I want to focus on today is a very short line that a great deal of Jewish practice is based on, kashrut, specifically eating milk and meat. If someone said, Rabbi, what is kosher all about? Obviously, there's a lot of little details, but more or less it's about what we eat and then how it's prepared. And, it's about ingredients. But the biggest issue, other than animals that are not kosher, like shrimp and gorillas, I don't know if anyone's eating that, but specifically eating milk and meat. So before I even go on, I'm just going to go ahead and read the first line and point out why this is, something weird is going on here. So the line in this week's parasha, and it's mentioned elsewhere in the Torah as well. Actually, it's mentioned 3 times, which is quite significant. So this is one of the 3 times. And the Hebrew says, lo tevashel. And the word tevashel or bishul usually translates as, oh, wonderful, Isabel's joining us, as cooking. However, it's a very specific kind of cooking. It's boiling, meaning liquid, meaning there's other words for roasting, etc., like that. So do not boil a gadi, which is a baby goat, like the Pesach song Had Gadya, one little baby goat, bachalev imo, in the milk or fat, depending on how you translate it, of its mother. So do not boil a baby goat in the milk of its own mother. Now, this line is hyper specific, but as we know, coming out of this, any milk and meat, whether it's hamburger and giraffe milk, and certainly chicken parmesan, except chicken is an avian. Chickens are avians, and they don't give milk. So what's going on here? How did we get from a hyper-specific line that's repeated 3 times in the Torah, specifically about goats and the milk of its mother, to any meat ever from any animal? But that's not even true, because fish aren't included. Why aren't fish included? So what we're going to see here is not only the express commentary of the rabbis as this idea develops, but we're also going to, try and figure out what's happening behind the scenes, because it's clear that the understanding of this mitzvah has developed throughout the ages. So what we're going to look at first is actually one of the earliest commentaries on how to understand this verse. And in many ways, it's pre-rabbinic, like early midrashic, and that's from Philo. So Philo was written during the Second Temple. So while that's certainly much, much later than the giving of the Torah, it's certainly one of the earlier sources we have. Some of the rabbis who were included in the Mishnah were there at the tail end of the Second Temple era between 2050 before the Common Era BCE. So some of them would have been familiar with this thinking, but Philo, even though he's not considered a classical rabbi, much of his writing is in line with classical Jewish thought. So Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And Philo brings kind of 2 ideas in here, and one of them I think resonates, and the other one didn't really get picked up in general, but let's go ahead and jump into it. So Lynn, please, source number 2 from Philo of Alexandrias, or Philo Judaeus, Philo the Jew.
It was grossly improper that the substance which fed the living animal should be used to season and flavor the same after its death, and that while nature provided for its conservation by creating the stream of milk and ordaining that it should pass through the mother's breasts as through conduits, the license of man should rise to such a height as to misuse what had sustained its life to destroy also the body which remains in existence.
Very simply, milk is a source of life. So don't use it to cook something which just died. Don't use it to add flavor to an animal which is just killed. So he makes it sort of an ethical consideration. So please continue.
If indeed anyone thinks it is good to boil flesh and milk, let him do so without cruelty and keeping clear of impiety. Everywhere there are herds of cattle innumerable, which are milked every day by cowherds, goat herds, and shepherds, whose chief source of income as cattle rearers is milk, sometimes liquid and sometimes condensed and coagulated into cheese. And since milk is so abundant, the person who boils the flesh of lambs or kids or any other young animal in their mother's milk shows himself cruelly brutal in character and gelded of compassion, the most vital of emotions and most nearly akin to the rational soul.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lynn. So there's a number of important things. The first one I said is he creates this becomes an ethical consideration, which is we want to make a distinction between that which causes life and that which is associated with death, i.e., killing the animal for food. And that idea, I think, still not only resonates today, but it's still considered one of the most popular explanations for why the separation of milk and meat. One is life, one is death. But there's a few other important things he does here that also continue on. The idea that even though the Torah just says a gedi, a baby goat, that this includes all animals, but his list, even though he only lists 2 animals or 3 animals, he includes cows, lambs, and kids. What do they all have in common? They all drink milk, mammals. So that's also something that we'll see established in the rabbis, that it's specifically those animals. So at this point, we've given an ethical consideration, and we've seen already the idea that this mitzvah is expanded to not just goats. Clearly, it means any kind of animal which is sustained by milk. But if that is true, then at this point, the idea of separating chicken and milk, and certainly fish and milk, which Sephardic Jews actually do separate, at this point, it doesn't make any sense. So now we're going to move on to the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah was codified in the second to third, like the year 220 of the Common Era. However, many of the opinions in the Mishnah can be traced back to the Second Temple era. So at least intellectually, what Philo was talking about and what some of the rabbis of the Mishnah were aware of line up. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And a lot of these sources come from a very specific book of the Mishnah and later the Talmud, which is Chulin. The word chol means something like secular, as opposed to animals which are sacrificed for the temple, and those would be kodashim, sanctified animals. Animals that are just used for everyday purposes, like food, are chol. They're just secular, regular animals. Hence why in the section of Chulin, it deals with a lot of the laws of kashrut that apply today for animals. So go ahead, please, Jane, source number 3, and then I'll have you take 4 as well.
All meat is forbidden to be cooked with milk except for the meat of fish and locusts, and it is forbidden to bring it up with cheese on the table except for the meat of fish and locusts.
Excellent. So a few important things here. The Hebrew starts with kol habasar, everything which is, and the word basar can be translated as meat or flesh, but it means, all of these animals, kosher animals that we eat. And that's important because they're establishing that, again, it's not just a goat. The understanding, whether or not this was the understanding of the Israelites wandering in the desert, it's clearly at this point, and again, we don't know the development of that because the prophets didn't talk about this in great detail, and there's not a lot of texts about it. But at this time, everyone has accepted that all kosher mammal species, domesticated mammalian species, are considered meat, and they can't be with milk. And the later Mishnah in the Talmud establishes that it doesn't matter if the milk matches the animal. So goat milk with cow milk is not okay, and vice versa, or any mixture thereof. But there's a really important thing here, which is there's a chutz, there's an exception here. Fish, they have flesh, they're a living animal, they don't fall into this category because they don't give milk, and locusts also don't give milk. But it doesn't mention birds here, and there are a lot of kosher birds. Why doesn't it mention birds? I'm not entirely certain, but the conversation about fowl birds is going to come up in just a few Mishnayot later. And the important thing, Jane, as you'll read now in a moment, is there's a little bit of a debate about what, that's probably why fish is not chicken and fowl more generally are not included in this source, because there is a debate about which category it fits into. Is it considered basar, all meat, which is accepted that it's separated from milk, or is it considered in the category of exceptions of fish and locusts? So go ahead, Jane, and then we'll pause for questions and unpacking, please.
Rabbi Akiva says, undomesticated animal and fowl are not prohibited by the Torah, as it is said, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk 3 times in the Hebrew Bible, to exclude 1, undomesticated animal, 2, fowl, and 3, impure domesticated animal. Rabbi Yossi the Galilean says, it is said, don't eat any carcass in the beginning of Deuteronomy. And it is said, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk at the end of Deuteronomy. That which is forbidden on account of carcass is forbidden to cook in milk. Fowl, which is forbidden on account of carcass, might one conclude that it's forbidden to cook in milk? Scripture says in its mother's milk, to exclude fowl which has no mother's milk.
Excellent. So there's a few things going on here. The Torah specifically, all it says is don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. It does not say that you can't, it doesn't say anything about eating it or not. So one of the parts of this conversation is not just about the eating it, but it's about whether one can actually do it. So I've talked in earlier classes about, could someone go to cooking school like the Cordon Bleu, and let's say I'm not going to eat the food, I just want to practice cooking it. Could I cook actual milk and meat? Could I make a cheeseburger? And the answer is no. Even if I'm making it for a non-Jew, I cannot do anything where I mix actual milk and meat. But practically, and we'll come back to this at the end, I could cook chicken and milk. So that's interesting. Why is that okay? But the key takeaway from source number 4 is the derivation at the end, which says that chicken is not included in this mitzvah. Why? Because the verse says in its mother's milk. Chickens or avian, birds in general are not mammals and they don't give milk. Therefore, it's not included. Now, the other thing it's talking about is by saying a goat is a domesticated animal. What about undomesticated animals? Do they fit in here? So the debate becomes, what is the Torah telling us? And then what do we do in practice? And that's what's going to start developing. So the Torah only tells us domesticated mammals, it's forbidden by the Torah to cook them with milk. What about these other animals? Maybe we can cook them with milk, but we shouldn't. And that's what we're going to see in one of the last sources. So giraffes are not domesticated, but nobody's going to permit one to eat a giraffe cheeseburger. Chicken are not domesticated mammals. Well, we don't eat chicken and milk. So one of the things that we see here in the Mishnah and the Talmud is that in the beginning, they were pretty clear on what the Torah said. And chicken parm should have been fine. And in fact, people probably ate the equivalent of chicken parm because that's not what the Torah said. The Torah said nothing about it. So why did it change? So now, before we go on to the next section, any questions up until now?
So an undomesticated animal is like if you come across a deer, but you kill it properly, that's an undomesticated animal.
Something like that. Well, it's interesting. It's like one of those, like, I don't know, not catch-22, but it's basically a contradiction because you can't properly slaughter a wild animal because they're not just going to stand there and take it. So because usually the only way to hunt a domesticated wild animal is to shoot it with an arrow, which makes it not kosher. So they bring in things about finding a dead animal on the road, which is forbidden. But let's say, again, I find a dead animal and I just want to cook it with milk. Technically, I haven't broken the Torah. Now, I can't eat it because it's not kosher because it died without being properly slaughtered. But again, the rabbis are, and this is an important, one of our last sources will really get into the importance of this. We're getting very technical here. And that's kind of what the rabbis do. They get very, very technical, but then at the end, you say, that's great, interesting technical conversation, but what can we eat? And that's going to come out even more in this next source in Gloria. Now we're in the Talmud. So we're a few hundred years after the Mishnah. And this is probably the most famous story about eating chicken or any kind of, actually, I think is it peacocks here, and milk. And this story represents a fascinating mystery to which I do not have the answer, but we can speculate about it. So go ahead, Gloria, please, source number 5.
Levi visited the house of Joseph the Fowler. They served him a peacock's head cooked in milk. He didn't say anything to them. When he came before Rabbi and told him what happened, Rabbi said to him, "Why didn't you excommunicate them?" He said to them, it was the locale of Rabbi
Yehuda ben
Betera. And I thought perhaps he expounded for them in accordance with Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, who said to exclude fowl, which has no mother's milk.
So the previous sources, that idea that the Torah says in the milk of its mother means only animals which give milk, that was Yosei Haglili. So we know that there was an opinion earlier in the Mishnah that chicken are not considered meat. But now this Levi goes to someone's house, and I keep saying chicken, but again, it's all oaf, it's all fowl, and he eats peacock, which presumably then is a kosher animal. I don't know if I knew that. I think it is. Unless this translation is incorrect, but let's say it's a kosher animal, and he had it with milk, or it had been cooked in milk, and he ate it and didn't say anything. Went to his rabbi. His rabbi said, he fed you treif. You should have excommunicated him. He said, except we know there's a valid opinion, says it's not treif. And maybe he was following, this goes back to our class on tradition, on minhag. He thought that the local custom of that land, that city, might have been that chicken or just fowl and milk is totally fine. And by the way, he might be right. And there's a lot of important takeaways to this story. One of them is that Jews were eating chicken and milk for a long time, well into the early, I don't know, say early medieval period, but certainly at the turn of the millennium, and perhaps for much, much longer. However, it wasn't just a matter of different customs. You can see the debate here in the Talmud getting to the point where it's not even like, oh, you have a different custom. There's this push now to forbid it. And one of the interesting things is there is a source in the Talmud that if you read the line, it pretty clearly says that fowl and cheese is fine together. But it says it very vaguely. And the next line that probably was an editor's, rewriting it, changed the meaning of it completely. So even in the Talmud, they're struggling against this. But again, the question is, why wasn't it okay to just have differing customs? So it's fine if the custom develops and become popularized that we just consider chicken to be dairy, but why do they need to fight? And again, there's a lot of mystery here. This is a conversation in history in which we don't have all the details. What they say is the victor, writes history. That's kind of what happened in the Talmud. Other than this one story, which implies that, yes, somebody did it, but it was bad that they did it, everyone pretty much accepts that chicken and dairy are no-go. And the earliest sources in the Mishnah seem to imply that the line was taken literally until it wasn't anymore. So what happened? And again, as I said, we don't know. However, Rambam in his Mishnah Torah tries to take a crack at it. He tries to sort of after the fact, not rewrite history, but try and rationalize what happened. So he says, in continuing in his laws of forbidden foods, machalot asurot, similarly, the meat of a non-domesticated animal and fowl, whether cooked in the milk of a non-domesticated animal or in the milk of a domesticated animal, is not forbidden to eat by the Torah. We saw that. That's clear in the Mishnah, and that's the reason why today cooking a mammal like cow, like a hamburger, and making a cheeseburger is completely forbidden to do anything. That's the rabbi's understanding. Anything that's covered by that mitzvah, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. You can't cook it, you can't eat it, and you can't get benefit from it. What does that mean? The other day, I was at Sendik's and there was a gentleman outside who needed food. So I said, can I get you something? And I went in and I got him food, but I made sure that the food I got him was not, he wanted like beef with a dairy sauce on it, and I can't get that for him. I am forbidden to get any benefit, even giving meat and dairy, Torah forbidden meat and dairy to a non-Jew. Even to my cat. When I buy cat food, I need to make sure that there is no meat and dairy in there. So a lot of people probably don't think about that. That's when we're talking about forbidden by the Torah. But rabbinically forbidden, like locusts and fowl and undomesticated animals, we're not allowed to eat it, but we can cook it. So I can go to cooking school and I can make all the chicken parm I want, and we can get benefit. I guarantee that, the chicken flavored whatever that I give to my cat, if it probably has dairy in it, and that's fine. Chicken and cheese to give is fine. Jane, yes, go for it, please.
Does that mean that I can't work in a food kitchen or volunteer in a food kitchen?
So specifically, if specifically you're serving something that has, or let's say a Jew is serving something that has Torah forbidden meat and dairy, that would potentially be an issue. There might be ways to get around it, but generally, no, we cannot give anything that is forbidden by the Torah with meat and dairy to even a non-Jew to get benefit in that way. Again, I'd have to look in a little more to see if food kitchens have exceptions, but strictly speaking, they talk about a case where, a restaurateur has, somehow he got a delivery of something forbidden by the Torah. Cheeseburgers is just the easiest example of it. And he obviously can't eat it or sell it in his kosher restaurant, but he can't give it to his dog either. He actually has to throw it away. So it is an issue that a lot of people don't think about. And again, it's an issue with giving food to pets, which probably comes up a lot, and a lot of people aren't conscious of it.
This is an issue of tzedakah. It's quite different, I think, than giving foods to pets.
So it's interesting you say that. A positive mitzvah, giving charity, would not trump a negative mitzvah. And that's the key here. The understanding of the rabbis is the repetition of 3 times, do not cook a kid in its mother milk, And again, this is midrashic, but it is the accepted understanding of the mitzvah, is that it forbids again, cooking, eating, or getting any kind of benefit from, or giving to another person, a mammal, a kosher mammal mixed with milk of any animal. However, if it was beef, whether or not it's shechted correctly, slaughtered correctly, with pig milk, then it would be fine, because it's only meat from a kosher animal and milk from a kosher animal that's an issue from the Torah. So again, at the soup kitchen, I can follow up with you specifically and see if there are exceptions to that. However, it certainly might be an issue, and again, people are not always conscious of it. However, that's only with mammals, but with fowl, it's not an issue. So that's what he starts out by saying. Oh, and he says explicitly, therefore, it is permitted to cook it together, and it is permitted to derive benefit from it. And I keep saying derive benefit, but again, it's giving it to anyone, giving it to a dog, pet, or even another person. But it is forbidden to eat by rabbinic law. So the question we started with is, what's the deal with chicken parm? Is it forbidden by the Torah as long as the chicken is slaughtered and the cheese is kosher? The answer is no, it is not forbidden by the Torah, but it is forbidden by the rabbis. And what we saw was not always forbidden by the rabbis. It is something that developed and changed. Now it's become universally accepted, but it wasn't. And again, we don't 100% know why, but Rambam's attempt, he hypothesizes, but it is forbidden to eat by rabbinic law in order that people don't get carried away and come to violate the biblical prohibition against milk and meat and eat the meat of a pure domesticated animal cooked in the milk of a pure domesticated animal. For the literal meaning of scripture refers only to a kid cooked in the milk of its actual mother. Therefore, they forbade all meat with milk. So we actually saw in the Mishnah that they expanded goat to all kinds of mammals. But now he's taking it one step further, which is that the rabbis at some point said we really got to include just all animals, including chicken. But again, why not fish? And what the Rambam is positing here is that when you go to a soup kitchen or to the Sendik's meat counter or to any kind of big meal and stuff like that, when people talk about meat, the way that experientially, culturally we consider meat is, even though fish and chicken chicken and beef are obviously different, strictly speaking, they're all kind of treated the same. They're cooked together. If you have a stew, you might just throw in chicken and beef, which is kosher, that's fine. But if you're treating all meat the same, and you go to a meat market, and you have the chicken here, and this is again, you go to Quick Kosher here in town, and in the freezer section, you have all of the briskets here and all the chicken here. Even though they're obviously taste different and look different, they're all kind of categorized together. So perhaps at one point in the world of the rabbis, meat was just all, which again is today, it developed that meat all kind of got thrown together. It could also be that maybe chicken or fowl was not as popular. So maybe it was more meat and there wasn't an issue of them eating as much fowl. Maybe fowl was a delicacy, or vice versa. Maybe everybody only ate fowl, so it was very easy to think of it as a separate thing, and meat was a delicacy, so when you rarely ate a brisket, you knew to be careful. But once the market started to just be shelves or pots or tables just covered with chicken and beef and veal, which I think kind of looks like it, at that point, then you might start saying, and it's just like kitniot on Pesach. The reason we don't eat, Ashkenazim don't eat rice and all of these other legumes, is because the rabbis were concerned that they would get mixed together, that we might get confused, we might make mistakes. Why do we have separate dishes? Because we might get confused about when we last used the dish to eat a dairy meal. So what we're getting in here is that the reason we don't eat chicken and dairy is basically that it's just a fence around the Torah, according to Rambam in his Mishnah Torah. Now, is that the real reason for it? We're not sure. There's so many other hypothetical possibilities. But regardless, we can see that it was not taken for granted. It was already the law in the Torah, which had a very specific, clear meaning, expanded and expanded and expanded. And this gives you such an insight into how the Torah is developed. It's something that is reflected by the reality. And the reality is the way that meat was eaten influenced the way that we understood the mitzvah. So it's really interesting. I decided the other day that I just don't want to get real chicken nuggets anymore, because the Gardein fake chicken nugget ones I think are far more delicious, and I don't have to ever be flesh anymore. So if we get to the point where all meat gets replaced by fake meat, does the idea of not eating milk and dairy, does that just disappear? Or will the rabbis say, now that the reality is that there's no real meat anymore, we want to separate milk from this because it still represents life and it's symbolic. Rabbinically, it gets very complicated when you bring in context and reality. So that's the Rambam's hypothesis. Before we look at the final source, any questions up until now? Excellent. So this last source here, I think, is really cool, partly for what it talks about, but also who wrote it. I don't know if anyone recognizes the name of this professor, Dr. Jordan Rosenblum. It's cool. It's not only a very bright man, but he also teaches at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So it's not right next door to us, but he is a local hero, as it were. And he wrote a great deal about this, and he influenced some of the sources I brought. But he asked a great question. If the issue is separating life and death, as Philo had suggested, and the rabbis liked that idea, why, and then we say that meat, like cow, can't be had with milk because it's a mammal. Why should we be able to eat chicken omelets? Eggs are a source of life. So why is it okay to eat eggs and chicken? And his answer, even if that might be obvious to you, kind of gives a nice review, summary, and insight into this whole conversation. So he says, but if Jews can't eat meat and milk together, why can they eat chicken and eggs together? And by the way, you can also eat eggs and beef, eggs and anything. Egg is totally parv. You can eat it with anything. We have seen that normative rabbinic opinion prohibiting the consumption of meat with milk develops to include fowl. And we saw that development in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, at least in practice, in the broader injunction in Deuteronomy 14:21. So that's our Parsha, and the verse we started with, to not cook a kid in its mother milk. Unlike Philo, however, the rabbis decide that this biblical law is not about compassion, mercy, or kindness, but about compliance with divine rule. And again, if Rambam is right, and it's about a technicality, a fence around the Torah to make sure we keep the mitzvah properly, it's not about ethics, because if it was ethically about separating life and death, then eggs, which are a source of life, shouldn't be able to be allowed eaten with fowl. And since for the rabbis, the law isn't about compassion, mercy, or kindness, and he's not saying that the rabbis are not compassionate, merciful, or kind. They apply it in many other cases, but not here. Then milk and eggs are not analogous. Eggs are not milk, so they present no problem, unless, like Philo, one is making an ethical argument, which the rabbis are not. And further, since the rabbis don't consider eggs to be meat, then there's no problem with cooking, eating, or deriving benefit from eggs and milk. So he does a lot of interesting things here, but he also points out how the way that the rabbis understand the purpose of a mitzvah, meaning we don't just open the Torah, I've said this before, we don't just open it and follow it to the letter, because it's not always clear exactly what it's saying. So you have to understand what the mitzvah is saying in order to rule practically. And if you think that the whole point of it is to ethically separate life from death, the rulings will look very, very different. But if you think it's simply God saying, do not eat mammals cooked with the milk of kosher mammals, which is how the rabbis understand it, then that's what they interpret. But then, out of an abundance of caution, according to Rambam, who very well might be right, they decided to include other foods which are called meat. And by the way, even though technically you might say, meat and poultry, experientially, most people treat chicken as meat. At a meat restaurant, you can get a chicken sandwich. Just the way that people approach chicken is very similar to the way they approach beef. Now, it may be different in other cultures, but certainly for the rabbis, for them, chicken was meat and should be treated like meat. Fish, on the other hand, is not treated like meat. Fish joints are a separate entity altogether, which is why it's even more interesting that Sephardim have a practice to not eat fish and milk together, and it probably is born out of a similar idea. So it's not simply, what does God tell us to do in the Torah? It's what do we understand that God is telling us to do? And now how do we interpret it based on the world we live in? And when the world starts changing, our understanding starts changing, and so does the ruling. So this is not to say that we are not following the law of God, but our understanding of it often changes, and the laws are reflective of that. Very practically, again, I can go cook a chicken and cheese sandwich and give it to a non-Jew, but I can't work in a McDonald's, or I could only work on the fries.